Hey everyone, I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you relax tonight. I know a lot of you use this video to fall asleep, so before we start, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, tell me in the comments, where are you from, and what time is it there? Now get comfortable, take a deep breath, and just relax.
The Midnight Walker. This incident changed how I view my neighborhood forever. It was about 4 years back and I was 32 years old, living in a quiet district in Norway. My nightly walks had become a ritual, something I did to clear my head after long workdays. The area had always felt secure, one of those places where people left their bikes unlocked and children played until dark. But recently, things had shifted. The local news started reporting more break-ins, more assaults. Gang activity was creeping into our peaceful streets like a disease. Still, I convinced myself that if you kept to yourself and stayed aware, you'd be fine. How wrong I was. It was a Tuesday night in October, just past midnight. The air was crisp, and the streets were empty except for the occasional cat darting between parked cars. I remember the moon was hidden behind clouds, making everything feel darker than usual. As I rounded the corner near Maple Street, I noticed a tall residential complex ahead. Mrs. Erickson lived there, my former history teacher who'd retired just the previous year. She must have been 55 by then, living alone on the third floor. That's when I saw them. Two men, both wearing dark clothing, were moving around the building in a way that immediately struck me as wrong. They weren't walking with purpose like residents heading home. Instead, they were prowling, circling the structure like predators stalking prey. My pace slowed as I watched them, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. One was taller, maybe 6 feet, wearing a baseball cap pulled low. The other was stockier, with a nervous energy that made him constantly shift his weight from foot to foot. They kept looking up at the windows, then at each other, then back at the building. The taller one suddenly stretched up on his toes, pressing his face close to a ground floor window, cupping his hands around his eyes to see inside. My stomach tightened. This wasn't right. The shorter one bent down and picked up what looked like a metal rod from beside a dumpster. He tested its weight in his hand, swinging it slightly. That's when the reality hit me like ice water. These men were planning to break in, and I had just wandered into the middle of their crime. The moment they spotted me, everything changed. Both men froze completely, their heads turning in perfect synchronization to stare directly at me. The taller one's hand moved to his pocket, and I didn't want to know what he was reaching for. Every instinct in my body screamed danger. My mouth went dry and I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I had to make a decision fast. Running would make me look like prey, but standing there wasn't an option either. I chose to turn left, trying to appear casual, like I hadn't noticed anything unusual. But my options weren't great. The path I chose led past an elementary school and through an open park area. No houses, no witnesses, just empty space and darkness. As I walked, I pulled out my phone, pretending to take a call, hoping it might discourage them. I spoke loudly to no one, laughing occasionally, trying to seem relaxed. But when I glanced back, they had moved. They were no longer by the building. My blood ran cold when I couldn't spot them anywhere. I picked up my pace slightly, still trying not to run. The school loomed on my right, its dark windows like empty eyes. As I reached the corner where the path turned toward the park, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. There they were, crouched behind a row of bushes about 30 meters away, watching me. Waiting. They had circled around somehow, positioning themselves along my route home. There was no innocent explanation for this. They were hunting me. My hands were shaking now, and I could feel sweat running down my back despite the cold air. I was still 8 blocks from home, and the path ahead was isolated. I made a desperate decision. I unzipped my jacket and pulled it off, wrapping it around my arm. If they came at me, at least I'd have something to block with. Then I did something that probably saved me. Instead of continuing forward into the darkness of the park, I suddenly turned and jogged back toward the residential area, toward lights and potential witnesses. I didn't look back this time. I just moved, not quite running but close to it. I took a different route, doubling back through better lit streets where apartments had windows facing the sidewalk. My breathing was ragged and every shadow made me flinch. A car passed and I almost flagged it down, but it was gone before I could react. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably 15 minutes, I reached my apartment building. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely get the key in the lock. Once inside, I rushed to my window and carefully peered out. The street was empty, but I knew they had been there, planning something terrible. I called the police and reported what I'd seen, but without more evidence, there wasn't much they could do. They said they'd increase patrols in the area. 2 days later, I learned that Mrs. Erickson's building had been burglarized. An elderly man on the first floor had been attacked and robbed. It happened the very next night after my encounter. I still take walks, but everything is different now. I go out earlier, never past 10 o'clock. I vary my routes. I carry a personal alarm. And I always stay in well-lit areas where people can see me. That night taught me that sometimes the difference between being a victim and getting home safely is just recognizing danger a few seconds sooner and trusting your instincts completely. The sleepover nightmare. I need to tell you about the most terrifying night of my teenage years. I was 15 and it was winter break 5 years ago. My parents had left for a week-long cruise to celebrate their anniversary, trusting me to stay home alone for the first time. Of course, I immediately planned a sleepover with my closest friends. The weather that day was absolutely miserable. Rain hammered against the windows like someone throwing handfuls of gravel, and thunder rolled across the sky every few minutes. The forecast warned of potential flooding, and the wind was bending trees almost horizontal. It was the kind of storm that made you grateful to be inside, safe and warm. My friends started arriving around 4 in the afternoon. First came Kai, my best friend since kindergarten, carrying his sleeping bag and a bag full of snacks. Then John and Nick showed up together, brothers who lived 2 streets over. Robin arrived next, and finally Marcus, who was always late to everything. But this time Robin brought someone extra. His uncle Blake. Blake was 28, and Robin's parents had insisted he come along since my parents were away. I was actually relieved. Blake was cool, not like most adults. He had tattoos covering both arms, trained in mixed martial arts, and even coached professional fighters at a gym downtown. He was built like a truck but had this easy laugh that made everyone comfortable around him. Having him there made me feel safer, especially with the storm raging outside. We set up camp in the living room first. Blake ordered 3 large pizzas and some wings, telling us to pick whatever movie we wanted while he made sure all the doors and windows were locked. The storm was getting worse and the lights flickered occasionally, making us all joke nervously about losing power. We decided on a horror movie, something about a haunted house. The timing felt perfect with the storm providing a natural soundtrack. We were about 20 minutes in when the doorbell rang. Blake paused the movie and headed to the door, looking through the peephole first. He stood there for a moment, then opened it slowly. The delivery driver was standing under a black umbrella, water streaming off the edges. Blake later told us the man was probably in his 30s, about 6 feet tall, wearing a pizza company jacket that looked too small for him. But it was his face that made Blake uncomfortable. The man was smiling, but it wasn't a normal customer service smile. It was too wide, showing too many teeth, and his eyes weren't smiling at all. They were flat, like a shark's eyes, just staring. Blake said something felt immediately wrong. The man didn't say anything at first, just held out the pizza boxes while maintaining that disturbing grin. When Blake reached for them, the man didn't let go right away, forcing this awkward moment where they were both holding the boxes. Finally, Blake pulled harder and took them. He handed over the cash, told him to keep the change, and started to close the door. The man didn't move. He just stood there, still smiling, rain running down his face. Blake had to actually say goodbye twice before the guy finally turned and walked away. Blake didn't tell us how unsettled he was at the time. He just brought the pizzas in and we continued with our night. But he did make sure to double-check that the door was locked, and I noticed him glance out the window a few times. We finished the movie around 11:30. The storm had gotten even worse, and the thunder was so loud it set off a car alarm down the street. We decided to move upstairs to the guest room, which was bigger than my room and had a thick carpet perfect for sleeping bags. Blake said he'd stay downstairs on the couch to watch TV, joking that horror movies didn't affect him, but he wanted to catch up on his shows anyway. The guest room was at the end of the hallway on the 2nd floor. It had 2 large windows facing the backyard. Nick and I took the queen-size bed while everyone else arranged their sleeping bags on the floor. We talked for maybe half an hour, mostly about school and games, before people started drifting off to sleep. I was just entering that drowsy state between awake and asleep when Nick grabbed my shoulder. His grip was tight, scared. I opened my eyes to see his face inches from mine, his eyes wide with fear. He whispered so quietly I could barely hear him over the rain. He said someone was at the window. At first I thought he was joking or half asleep. But then I heard it. A deliberate knocking, rhythmic and insistent. Not the random sound of a branch in the wind, but purposeful. Human. My body went rigid. We were on the second floor. There shouldn't be anyone at our window. Nick and I lay frozen for what felt like forever but was probably only seconds. Then a shadow moved across the window. Through the rain-blurred glass we could see a dark figure. Someone in a hood, pressed close to the glass. They were trying to see inside. Terror shot through me like electricity. I jumped up and ran to the window just as the figure placed their hands on the frame and started to lift. I slammed my hands down on the lock just as they tried to raise the window. For one horrible second we were face to face through the glass. I couldn't see features clearly through the rain and darkness, but I saw that smile. Crooked teeth, with one particularly long canine that seemed to gleam. The same disturbing grin from earlier, but now predatory and eager. I screamed. Not a brave shout, but a terrified shriek that woke everyone instantly. The figure pulled back from the window as my friends scrambled up in confusion. Then the knocking turned to pounding. Aggressive, angry hammering against the glass. The person started yelling something, but between the storm and our panic, the words were just noise, guttural and threatening. We ran. All of us, tumbling over each other to get out of the room and down the stairs. Blake was already on his feet when we burst into the living room, and the look on his face when we told him someone was at the upstairs window was something I'll never forget. It wasn't fear. It was fury. He grabbed my two bulldogs, Max and Bruno, who had been sleeping in their beds. He told us to lock the door behind him and call 911, then he went outside into the storm. We watched from the window as he ran around to the side of the house, the dogs barking and snarling beside him. That's when we saw the ladder. It was leaning against the house, reaching up to the guest room window. Our ladder from our own garage. Blake followed muddy footprints that led from the ladder to the backyard. The rain was washing them away, but they were still visible in the mud. Blake found him hiding behind our garden shed, crouched down like he thought he was invisible. The moment the dogs spotted him, they went insane, pulling so hard Blake almost lost his grip on their collars. The man tried to run, but he slipped in the mud. The dogs reached him first, one grabbing his jacket, the other his pants leg. Blake reached him a second later. I'd never seen Blake fight before. It wasn't like movies. It was quick, brutal, and efficient. 2 punches and the man was on the ground, curled up and no longer fighting. Blake kept him pinned there, kneeling on his back while we called the police. It took them 40 minutes to arrive because of the storm and flooding on some roads. The man didn't struggle anymore, just lay there in the mud while Blake held him and the dog stood guard, growling if he so much as twitched. When the police finally came, they had to wrap the man's hands because Blake had broken several of his fingers in the fight. That's when Blake told them he was certain it was the same man who had delivered our pizza. The same height, the same disturbing smile, even the same jacket, though he'd removed the pizza company logo. The police said he'd been watching houses, posing as a delivery driver to scope out potential targets. They found a knife in his pocket and rope in his car, which was parked 2 blocks away. The detective who interviewed us later said the man had been arrested before for break-ins and assault but had been released just months earlier. He specifically targeted houses where he knew parents were away, which meant he'd been watching our house, planning this. I couldn't sleep properly for months after that. Every noise at night made me panic. My parents installed a security system, cameras, motion sensor lights, everything. Blake checked on me regularly and my friends and I became closer than ever, bonded by that terrible night. Now, 5 years later, I still triple-check locks. I never ordered delivery when I'm home alone. And my dogs, who proved themselves that night, sleep in my room. Always. They're older now but still protective, still watching. Sometimes I catch them staring at the windows at night and I wonder if they remember too. If they're watching for that crooked smile in the darkness, making sure it never comes back. The children who cook stones. I grew up in Abidjan, the largest city in Ivory Coast, though this story happened when I was just 6 years old. I'm 16 now, but I remember every detail like it happened yesterday. Some memories burn themselves into your mind so deeply that time can't fade them. This is one of those memories. We lived in a small apartment on the 4th floor of an old building near the Plateau district. It wasn't fancy, but it was home. My parents both worked long hours. My father was a bank clerk, and my mother sold fabrics at the Grand Market. They loved me dearly but couldn't always be there, so they hired a babysitter named Aminata to watch me after school and on weekends. Aminata was 19, a university student studying to become a teacher. She was kind but often distracted, spending a lot of time on her phone or reading her textbooks while I played. I didn't mind. I was used to entertaining myself, though I was desperately lonely. There were no other children in our building, just elderly couples and young professionals. The nearest playground was too far to walk to safely. One Saturday afternoon, the heat was particularly oppressive, the kind that made the air shimmer and stick to your skin like wet cloth. I was bored, restless, and begged Aminata to take me outside. She finally agreed, probably just to stop my whining. We went down to the courtyard, where she sat on a bench under an acacia tree while I kicked around a half-deflated football I'd found. Next to our building stood an old structure that fascinated me. It was a single-story house made entirely of weathered wood, painted blue once but now faded to the color of the sky before a storm. It seemed so out of place surrounded by concrete apartment buildings, like something from another time. My mother had told me to stay away from it, saying the family who lived there was different, though she never explained what that meant. That day I saw them. 5 children playing in the dirt yard beside the wooden house. They were laughing, running around, completely absorbed in some game. My heart leaped with excitement. Finally, other kids to play with. They looked like siblings ranging from maybe 8 to 14 years old. 3 girls and 2 boys, all wearing simple, worn clothes but seeming happy. I ran to Aminata, begging her to let me play with them. She looked up from her phone, squinting in the sunlight, and watched the children for a moment. They seemed harmless enough, just kids being kids. She nodded and told me to stay where she could see me. I approached them shyly at first. The oldest girl noticed me and smiled. She had intricate braided hair and kind eyes. She asked if I wanted to join their game, and I nodded eagerly. They were playing a version of hide and seek, but with rules I didn't quite understand. Still, they included me, and for the first time in months I felt like I belonged somewhere. After maybe an hour of playing, the oldest girl announced she needed to prepare dinner for her siblings. In my culture, it's not unusual for older children to cook, but she couldn't have been more than 14. I was curious and always eager to help, asked if I could assist her. She looked at me strangely for a moment, then smiled that same kind smile and said yes. She led me to the side of their house where they had a cooking area. 3 large stones formed a triangle with charcoal and wood arranged beneath for a fire. She pulled out a huge aluminum pot, the kind used for cooking for large families, and set it on the stones. Then she turned to me with a request that seemed odd even to my 6-year-old mind. She asked me to gather stones. Not wood for the fire, which was already burning, but stones. Small ones and big ones, she specified. She pointed to a pile of rocks near their fence and told me to bring as many as I could carry. I was confused but wanted to be helpful, so I did as she asked. I made several trips, carrying rocks of various sizes, while she tended to the fire and her siblings continued playing nearby. She began placing the stones I'd collected into the pot. First the larger ones, then the smaller ones on top. She added no water, no oil, nothing else. Just rocks in a pot over a fire. I watched, bewildered, as she covered the pot with a wooden lid and began stirring the fire beneath to make it burn hotter. The logical part of my young brain knew this made no sense. Stones don't cook. They don't turn into food. But she seemed so confident, so sure of what she was doing. Her siblings had gathered around now, watching with anticipation like this was completely normal. After about 10 minutes, she announced it was ready. My heart was pounding, though I didn't understand why. Something felt wrong, like the air itself had changed. It felt heavier, charged with something I couldn't name. The other children were smiling, but their smiles seemed different now, hungrier. She lifted the lid, and I'll never forget what I saw. The pot was full of rice, white and fluffy, with pieces of meat and vegetables mixed in. The smell hit me immediately, rich and savory, making my mouth water. It looked perfect, like jollof rice my mother made for special occasions. But I had watched her put only stones in that pot. Only stones. The other children immediately grabbed bowls and began serving themselves, eating eagerly. The oldest girl filled a bowl and held it out to me. The food smelled incredible, and I was hungry from playing. I reached for the bowl, my fingers almost touching it, when I heard Aminata screaming my name. She was running toward us, her face twisted with fear I'd never seen before. She grabbed my hand so hard it hurt and pulled me away from the children. She was speaking rapidly in Bao, our local language, words I didn't fully understand but recognized as prayers or protections. The children just watched us go, not trying to stop us, still holding their bowls of impossible food. Aminata dragged me all the way back to our apartment. her hand shaking in mine. Once inside, she locked the door and made me wash my hands 3 times with soap, then once more with water she'd blessed with salt. She called my mother at work, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. My mother came home early, something she never did, and they talked for a long time in the kitchen while I was sent to my room. Later, my mother sat with me and explained, in the simple terms a 6-year-old could understand, that some people in this world practice things we don't understand. She said the Woodenhouse family was known in the neighborhood for practicing old ways, things that weren't necessarily evil but weren't safe for us to be around. She made me promise never to go near that house again, never to play with those children, and most importantly, never to eat anything they offered. I kept that promise, but I watched them sometimes from our window. The children continued to play in their yard, seeming normal and happy. But sometimes I'd see them cooking with their strange methods, and other neighborhood children would join them for meals. Some of those children were never quite the same afterward. They became quieter, more distant, like part of them had been left in that wooden house. Years later, when I was 12, the wooden house was demolished to make way for a new apartment complex. The family moved away overnight, leaving nothing behind. But sometimes when I pass that spot, I can still smell that impossible food cooking, and my stomach turns with a hunger that isn't quite my own. Now, at 16, I understand more about what I might have witnessed. My grandmother, before she passed, told me about old practices from the village, about people who could transform reality through will and ritual. She said some families carried these abilities through generations, neither good nor evil, just different. She also said that eating food prepared through such methods could bind you to things you don't understand, change you in ways that can't be undone. I don't know if what I saw was real magic, illusion, or something else entirely, but I know what I witnessed with my own eyes. I know that stones became food, and I know that Aminata saved me from something that day. Since then, I'm extremely careful about where and what I eat. I politely decline meals at houses I don't know well. Some might call it paranoia, but I call it wisdom learned young. Because I've seen firsthand that not every meal is what it appears to be, and some hungers, once fed, can never be satisfied. The Man in the Alley. This story was shared with me at a gathering by someone who worked in construction for years. He'd been an apprentice to a master builder, and what happened that day still makes him lose sleep, even though it occurred over a decade ago. It started like any other job. A homeowner had called their company requesting repairs on an old property he'd recently purchased. The address led them deep into the southern district of the city, an area known for its winding streets and forgotten corners. The neighborhood was one of those places that seemed frozen in time, where buildings from different decades stood shoulder to shoulder, and narrow alleys created a labyrinth that even GPS struggled to navigate. After 40 minutes of wrong turns and dead ends, they finally located the house. It sat at the end of a particularly narrow alleyway, barely wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side. The walls on either side were stained with years of weather and neglect, and the morning shadows made the passage feel like a tunnel. The house itself was unremarkable, a 2-story structure with peeling paint and windows that hadn't been cleaned in years. The owner met them at the entrance. He was an average-looking man in his 40s, wearing a business suit that seemed out of place in such a run-down area. He explained that he'd bought the property as an investment and needed significant repairs before he could rent it out. His family, a wife and 2 young children, would stay with relatives for the week while the work was completed. He handed over the keys, pointed out the main issues that needed addressing, and left without much ceremony. The crew consisted of 4 people. There was the master builder, a gruff man in his 50s who'd seen everything in his 30 years of construction work. There were 2 laborers, one a weathered 40-year-old named Carlos who rarely spoke but worked like a machine, and the other a cheerful 20-something named Miguel who filled the silence with jokes and stories. And finally there was the storyteller himself, then just 25 and still learning the trade. They began work at 8 in the morning. The house had good bones but needed extensive repairs. Water damage had rotted several ceiling beams, the electrical system was dangerously outdated, and the plumbing hadn't been touched since the 1970s. They divided the tasks, with the master builder and the apprentice working inside while Carlos and Miguel prepared cement outside for the foundation repairs. By 10 o'clock, the sun had climbed high enough to flood the alley with harsh light. The apprentice stepped outside to check on the progress and found Carlos and Miguel mixing cement near the entrance. They had set up their materials in the narrow space, and the rhythmic scraping of shovels against the mixing trough created an almost hypnotic sound that echoed off the alley walls. Miguel was in the middle of telling a story about his weekend, gesturing wildly with his cement-covered hands, when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence. His eyes fixed on something at the far end of the alley. Carlos followed his gaze, and the apprentice turned to look as well. Someone was entering the alley. At first, it was just a silhouette against the bright street beyond, but as the figure moved closer, details became horrifyingly clear. The person walking toward them was wrong in every possible way. He was short, perhaps 5 feet tall, but his body was unnaturally wide, as if someone had compressed a much larger person into a smaller frame. His arms hung down past his knees, too long for his stunted torso, and his legs were so short that his walk was more of a shuffle. But it was his face that made them all take an involuntary step backward. The skin looked melted, as if exposed to tremendous heat, with thick scar tissue creating ridges and valleys across what should have been normal features. One eye was significantly lower than the other, and his mouth was twisted into a permanent grimace that exposed yellowed, broken teeth. Patches of his scalp were bare where scar tissue prevented hair growth, and what hair remained hung in greasy strands. The man stopped about 10 feet from them. The smell hit them then, a mixture of unwashed body, infection, and something else, something sweet and rotten that made the apprentice's stomach turn. The deformed man's good eye focused on Miguel, and his twisted mouth attempted what might have been a smile. It was the most disturbing expression any of them had ever seen, like watching damaged machinery try to mimic human emotion. Without warning, the man began moving toward Miguel. Not walking exactly, but lurching forward with surprising speed despite his deformities. Miguel stood frozen, his youth and inexperience leaving him paralyzed with fear. The cement shovel fell from his hands with a clatter that seemed impossibly loud in the narrow space. Carlos reacted first. Years of hard labor had given him strength and reflexes that kicked in when thinking failed. He grabbed his own shovel and held it horizontally across his body, stepping between Miguel and the approaching figure. His voice was steady but carried an edge that the apprentice had never heard before. "Stop right there. Don't come any closer." The deformed man paused, tilting his head at an unnatural angle as if trying to understand the words. His one good eye blinked slowly, and then he took another shuffling step forward, his long arms beginning to rise. Carlos's demeanor changed instantly. He shifted his grip on the shovel, holding it like a weapon, the blade pointed directly at the man's chest. His voice dropped to a growl that seemed to come from somewhere primal. "I said stop. Take one more step and I will split your skull open. I swear to God, I will end you right here in this alley and nobody will care." The threat hung in the air like electricity. The apprentice could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. Miguel had backed up against the wall, his face pale and covered in sweat. Even the master builder had come outside, drawn by the commotion, and stood watching from the doorway. The deformed man stood perfectly still for what felt like hours but was probably only 10 seconds. His good eye moved from Carlos to Miguel, then to the apprentice and finally to the master builder. Something shifted in his expression, a recognition perhaps that he was outnumbered, or maybe an understanding of the very real threat in Carlos's voice. Slowly, deliberately, the man began backing away. He never turned around, just shuffled backward down the alley, that one eye never leaving them until he reached the street and disappeared around the corner. The 4 men stood in stunned silence, the only sound their heavy breathing and the distant noise of traffic. They tried to return to work, but the atmosphere had changed. Every sound from the alley made them tense. Miguel couldn't stop his hands from shaking and eventually had to sit down. Carlos kept his shovel within arm's reach for the rest of the day. They worked mostly in silence, finishing earlier than planned and packing up their tools with unusual haste. The next 3 days they returned to complete the job, but the man never reappeared. They worked quickly, efficiently, always keeping someone stationed outside as an unofficial lookout. The alley, which had simply been narrow before, now felt oppressive, like the walls were slowly closing in. When the owner returned at the end of the week to inspect the completed work, they told him about the encounter. His initial reaction was confusion, claiming he had no idea who they were describing. But as they provided more details about the man's appearance, his expression changed. Recognition dawned on his face, followed quickly by something that looked like fear. He was quiet for a long moment before speaking. He said his father had grown up in this neighborhood, back when it was even poorer than it was now. When his father was young, maybe 7 or 8 years old, a man with severe leprosy had appeared in the area. Nobody knew where he came from, but his disease was advanced, his body twisted and scarred from years of untreated infection. The neighborhood children would run home screaming when they saw him. Adults would cross the street or duck into shops to avoid him. Some of the crueler residents would throw stones or garbage at him, trying to drive him away. He lived like that for years, sleeping in doorways, eating from trash bins, existing on the margins of humanity. The owner's father had felt sorry for him and would sometimes leave food on their doorstep, though he never got close enough to hand it to him directly. Then the owner paused, his face pale. He continued, saying the man had died over 30 years ago. His father had attended the pauper's funeral, one of only 3 people who showed up. They buried him in an unmarked grave in the cemetery at the edge of the district. There was no way the construction crew could have seen him. He'd been dead for decades. The apprentice said that when they heard this, the blood drained from all their faces. Carlos, who never showed emotion, actually crossed himself. Miguel quit the next day, said he couldn't work construction anymore. The apprentice himself had nightmares for months afterward, dreams where he was alone in that alley and the shuffling footsteps were getting closer, where he'd turn around and that melted face would be inches from his own. Even now, years later, he avoids narrow alleys. He takes the long way around if he has to, preferring wide streets with multiple exits. Because sometimes, late at night when he's trying to sleep, he remembers that twisted smile and wonders what would have happened if Carlos hadn't been there with his shovel. He wonders what the man wanted with Miguel, and why something that had been dead for 30 years was still walking through the alleys of the Southern District, still searching for something it would never find. The headless figure. My name is Gwen and I'm 21 now, but this happened when I was 5 years old. Some memories from childhood fade into vague impressions, but this one remains crystal clear, every detail burned into my mind like a photograph I can't throw away. We lived in a rented 2-story house on the outskirts of Manila. It was one of those older homes built in the 1980s, with wooden floors that creaked with every step and windows that rattled when the wind blew. The house always felt bigger than it was, with shadows that seemed to stretch longer than they should and corners that stayed dark even with all the lights on. My family consisted of my parents and Mary, a 19-year-old working student who helped with household chores in exchange for room and board while she attended college. Mary was like an older sister to me. She had long black hair that she always kept in a ponytail and a laugh that could fill the entire house. We would play games together, and she'd sneak me extra cookies when my mother wasn't looking. That particular afternoon was unremarkable in every way except for what happened. It was a Saturday, humid and heavy with the promise of afternoon rain. My parents' bedroom was on the 2nd floor, the largest room in the house, with windows that overlooked the neighbor's garden. I was there playing a game on my mother's phone, one of those simple matching games that could hold a 5-year-old's attention for hours. My parents had been watching television with me, but around 3 o'clock, they decided to go downstairs for merienda, our afternoon snack. My father asked if I wanted to come with them. They were having palabok, my favorite noodle dish, but I was too absorbed in my game to care about food. I shook my head without looking up from the screen, my little fingers tapping away at the colored blocks. My mother kissed the top of my head and they left, closing the door behind them with a soft click. I remember the sound specifically because it was the last normal thing that happened that day. About 5 minutes passed. The game had lost its appeal and my stomach was starting to rumble. The thought of those noodles downstairs suddenly seemed much more interesting than matching digital candies. I put down the phone and walked to the door, already imagining the savory taste of the palabok. I turned the doorknob and pulled. Nothing happened. The knob turned freely, so I knew it wasn't locked, but the door wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, using both hands, my little feet planted firmly on the floor. Still nothing. It felt like someone was holding it from the other side. My first thought was that Mary was playing a trick on me. She often did little pranks like hiding behind doors to jump out and scare me, always followed by tickles and laughter. This had to be another one of her games. I called out in my high, piping voice, "Mary, please open the door. I want to go downstairs now." Silence. I tried again, louder this time. "Mary, this isn't funny anymore. Open the door, please." I started knocking, then banging with my small fists. The sound echoed in the bedroom, but there was no response from the other side. Frustration mixed with the beginning of fear. I grabbed the doorknob with both hands and pulled with every ounce of strength in my 5-year-old body. The door cracked open just an inch, maybe 2. And through that gap I saw something that shouldn't exist. Standing directly outside the door was a figure in a long white nightgown, the kind my grandmother wore. But where the head should have been there was nothing. Not hidden, not covered, but simply absent. The nightgown collar ended at the shoulders and above it was empty space. The fabric moved as if there was a body inside it, breathing, shifting weight from foot to foot. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. 5-year-olds know about monsters from storybooks, but this was different. This was real, standing 3 feet away from me, separated only by a partially open door. I froze, my hands still on the doorknob, unable to move, unable to breathe. Then the figure moved. Through the crack in the door, I watched as it reached for something. A large bath towel, the blue one from our bathroom, appeared in its hands. The headless figure began wrapping the towel around the outside doorknob, then looping it through the stair railing that was just outside the room. It was tying me in, trapping me inside the bedroom. The logical part of my adult mind wants to rationalize this, to find an explanation. But 5-year-old me knew only terror. I could see the figure's hands, pale and definitely human, working methodically to secure the towel. The nightgown swayed with each movement, and where the neck should have been, I could see darkness, like looking into an empty sleeve. I tried to pull the door closed, but the figure had already started pushing from the other side. Through the widening gap I could see more details. The nightgown was old-fashioned, with small flowers embroidered on the collar. The figure was the size of an adult woman, but there was something wrong with how it moved, too smooth, too deliberate, like it was floating rather than walking. The door opened wider, and the figure began to enter the room. I could see the flat surface where the neck ended, not gore or blood, just an impossible absence. I screamed then, not a movie scream but the raw, primal sound of a terrified child. I slammed the door shut with strength I didn't know I had and backed away until I hit the bed. I stood there, sobbing now, watching the doorknob turn slowly back and forth. The door would push open slightly, then I would run forward and push it closed again. This horrible game went on for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Push, pull, while I screamed for my parents, for Mary, for anyone to help me. Then, suddenly Mary's voice came from the hallway. Not from right outside the door where the figure was, but from farther away near the stairs. She was calling my name, asking what was wrong. The doorknob stopped moving. I heard footsteps, Mary's familiar gait, coming closer. When she reached the door, she found the towel tied around the knob and through the railing, exactly as I had seen the figure do it. She looked confused, then concerned. She asked me what happened, and I told her about the headless person, my words tumbling over each other in panic. Mary's expression was skeptical. She untied the towel and opened the door fully. I burst out of the room and clung to her legs, still crying. She checked the hallway, even looked in the other rooms, but found nothing. No figure, no sign that anyone had been there except for the towel that had trapped me inside. When we went downstairs, my parents were calmly eating their merienda. They hadn't heard my screams, hadn't heard anything unusual. The television was on, but not loud enough to drown out the kind of noise I had been making. Mary told them what she'd found, and I added my story about the headless figure. They laughed, the kind of gentle laugh parents use when children tell impossible stories. My father ruffled my hair and said I had a vivid imagination. My mother made me a plate of palabok and suggested I eat something, that I was probably just hungry and confused. For years I accepted their explanation. Children do have vivid imaginations. Maybe I had dozed off and had a nightmare. Maybe the towel had somehow gotten tangled by accident. Maybe Mary really had been playing a prank and didn't want to admit it. I almost convinced myself it hadn't been real. But then, 15 years later, we had a house blessing performed by a priest. My family isn't particularly religious, but my mother had been having disturbing dreams and wanted the peace of mind. During the blessing, the priest asked if we'd had any unusual experiences we wanted to share. I told the story again, expecting more gentle laughter. This time, my parents didn't laugh. They exchanged a look I'd never seen before, something between fear and guilt. Then my mother spoke, her voice quiet and uncertain. She told me that when I was 3 in that same house, I had an imaginary friend. Nothing unusual about that, except for one incident they'd never forgotten. One day they found me in the kitchen, eating from an empty plate with invisible utensils, having a full conversation with no one. When they asked what I was doing, I said I was eating lunch with my friend. I described the food in detail, said it was delicious, thanked my friend for sharing. But there was nothing there, just me pretending to eat air. They had dismissed it as childhood imagination. but something about it had disturbed them enough that they still remembered it clearly 17 years later. They'd never connected it to what happened when I was 5, never thought the two incidents might be related. The priest listened to everything, then performed an especially thorough blessing of the house. He told us that sometimes spirits become attached to children because they're more open, more accepting. He said these spirits aren't always malevolent, but they're not meant to interact with our world. The headless figure might have been trying to keep me in that room for reasons we'll never understand. I'm 21 now and I still think about that day. I've tried to rationalize it 1,000 different ways. Maybe Mary was playing an elaborate prank with some kind of mannequin. Maybe I had a fever and hallucinated. Maybe the stress of being locked in triggered some kind of episode. But none of these explanations account for everything I saw, everything I felt. The image that haunts me most isn't even the headless figure itself. It's the deliberate way it tied that towel, the methodical movements of those pale hands. Whatever it was, it had a purpose, a plan. It wanted me trapped in that room, and if Mary hadn't come when she did, I don't know what would have happened next. I live in my own apartment now, and I always check that my doors open freely before I close them. I can't sleep in rooms with only one exit. And sometimes, when I'm alone and the house is quiet, I think I hear fabric rustling, like a long nightgown brushing against walls, and I have to turn on every light to convince myself nothing's there. The $20 decision. I'm sharing this story because I need to tell someone, and maybe putting it into words will help me process what I've been carrying for years. This happened in 2017 when I was 15, living in a small city in North Carolina. I'm Cherokee on my mother's side, and my parents raised us with strong values about community, especially helping other Native people when we could. It was a Tuesday in July, one of those suffocating summer afternoons where the humidity makes the air feel like soup. The temperature was pushing 95 degrees, and the asphalt shimmered with heat waves. I had picked up a part-time job at a grocery store across town, nothing fancy, just bagging groceries and collecting carts from the parking lot. I was saving money for a school trip to Washington, D.C. that coming fall. My shift started at 5:30, and with my parents at work and all my siblings moved out, I had to take the bus. The bus stop was a small shelter on Madison Avenue, just a bench with a partial roof that provided minimal shade. I arrived around 4:15, knowing the bus wouldn't come until 4:30. I had $35 in my pocket, carefully folded in my wallet. 20 for hanging out with friends after work, 15 for emergencies. I wasn't wearing my glasses that day. I'd broken them playing basketball the week before, and the new ones wouldn't be ready until Thursday. The world beyond 10 feet was a blur of colors and shapes, which is why I didn't notice the man approaching until he was relatively close. As he came into focus, I could see he was native like me. He had the kind of deep brown skin that spoke of generations under the sun, and his hair was long, woven into 2 traditional braids that hung past his shoulders. He wore a beaded necklace, the kind you see at powwows, with intricate patterns in blue and white. It was exactly like one my grandfather had worn before he passed, down to the eagle feather charm hanging from the center. The resemblance to my grandfather made me smile involuntarily. But as he got closer, I noticed things that made my smile fade. He appeared to be in his early 20s, but his face carried the exhaustion of someone much older. Deep purple bags hung under his eyes like bruises. His clothes were clean but worn, jeans with frayed ends and a t-shirt that had been washed so many times the original color was just a memory. What struck me most was his demeanor. He couldn't stand still. His fingers constantly moved to his necklace, rubbing the beads like a rosary. Every few seconds he would glance over his shoulder, quick, nervous movements like a deer checking for predators. When he looked back, his eyes would dart around, never settling on anything for more than a second. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but it wasn't just from the heat. This was the sweat of fear. Despite his obvious distress, I gave him a small wave and a polite smile. It's what my parents had taught me to do, to acknowledge another native person with respect. He saw my gesture and nodded back, just a quick dip of his head, but didn't smile. He stood about 5 feet away, shifting his weight from foot to foot. After maybe 2 minutes of uncomfortable silence, he spoke. His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it in a while. "Sister, could you help me out with some money?" The way he said sister hit me hard. It's how Native people address each other, a sign of kinship and community. My mind immediately went to the $35 in my pocket. 20 for friends, 15 for emergencies. This wasn't my emergency. I had plans for that money. I looked at his face again, saw the desperation there, but also saw my evening with friends disappearing. We were going to see a movie, get pizza afterward. It was all planned out. So I lied. The words came out smooth and easy like I'd practiced them. Sorry, I don't have anything on me. The change in his expression was immediate and horrible. His face went from desperate hope to something beyond disappointment. It was recognition, like he'd expected this answer but had hoped for something different. His shoulders sagged, and for a moment he looked even younger than his years. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something else, then closed it and just nodded. Then his entire body went rigid. His eyes fixed on something behind me, and the color drained from his face. I turned to follow his gaze and saw another man approaching from the parking lot across the street. This man was different in every way. White, probably in his 40s, built like someone who worked construction. His jeans were stained with what looked like motor oil, and his black t-shirt stretched tight across a beer belly. Heavy work boots made loud sounds against the pavement as he walked. But it was his expression that made my stomach drop. His face was twisted with rage, the kind of anger that had been building for a long time. The young native man took a step backward, then another. His hand went to his necklace again, gripping it so tight his knuckles went white. I could hear him breathing now, quick, shallow gasps. Every instinct in my body told me to move, to get away from whatever was about to happen. I grabbed my backpack and quickly crossed the street, my legs shaking. From the other side, I watched the older man approach. They were maybe 15 feet apart when words started flying. I couldn't make out everything, but I heard money, and time's up, and worse things, threats that made my blood cold. The young man was trying to explain something, his hands up in a placating gesture. I saw him reach into his pocket and pull out some crumpled bills, offering them to the older man. Even from across the street, I could see it wasn't enough. The older man slapped the money away, and the bills scattered in the wind. "I told you what would happen," the older man said, his voice carrying clearly across the street. "I told you I'd kill you if you didn't pay me back, you worthless piece of shit." The young man started to say something, maybe to beg, maybe to explain. But the older man reached behind his back, and when his hand came forward, he was holding a gun. It was black, looked huge in the afternoon sun. Time seemed to slow down, like my brain couldn't process what was happening fast enough. The first shot was impossibly loud. It echoed off the buildings, and I saw the young man's head snap back. He was already falling when the second shot hit him. By the third shot, he was on the ground, not moving. Blood was spreading across the concrete, darker than I expected, almost black in the harsh sunlight. A woman who'd been sitting at the bus stop screamed. The sound broke whatever spell had frozen me in place. I ran. I didn't think, didn't look back, just ran. My backpack bounced against my spine with each step, and my lungs burned, but I didn't stop. I ran the 8 blocks home, burst through the door, and collapsed in the living room. My parents found me there, sobbing and incoherent. They called the police immediately. 2 officers came to take my statement. I told them everything I could remember, described both men, the conversation about money, the 3 shots. They thanked me for the information and said they'd be in touch if they needed anything else. For 3 years, I tried to forget. I threw myself into school, into work, into anything that would keep my mind occupied. But at night, when everything was quiet, I would see his face again. Not the moment he died, but the moment I lied to him. The disappointment and resignation in his eyes haunted me more than the violence that followed. In 2020, I finally worked up the courage to ask my mother if she knew anything about the case. She'd been following it in the news and through the native community grapevine. She told me the young man's name was Edmund Little Crow, though everyone called him Eddie. He was 23, originally from the Cherokee Reservation but had moved to the city for work. Eddie had been supporting a family of 5. His mother, who was disabled, his younger sister, and his sister's 3 children. Their father had died in a construction accident 2 years earlier, and Eddie had stepped up as the primary provider. But the factory where he worked had closed, and he couldn't find another job that paid enough to support everyone. In desperation, he borrowed money from a loan shark, the man in the black shirt. According to the investigation, Eddie had borrowed $500 and had paid back $480. The interest had been brutal, but he'd managed to scrape together almost all of it through odd jobs and selling everything he owned. He was $20 short. $20. My mother told me this gently, not knowing how it would affect me. $20. I had $35 in my pocket that day. If I had given him the 20 he needed, he would have paid off his debt. He would have walked away. He would have gone home to his family. Instead, I lied to save money for a movie and pizza with friends. I chose my entertainment over his life, and he died for $20 while I had that exact amount in my pocket. The guilt is a physical thing that lives in my chest. It makes it hard to breathe sometimes, especially when I see someone asking for help. My parents raised me to be generous, to help others in our community, especially other Native people who were struggling. They taught me that we survive by supporting each other, that individual wealth means nothing if the community suffers. But when it mattered most, when someone from my community needed help, I turned away. I lied. And while I didn't pull the trigger, I can't shake the feeling that I loaded the gun. If I had been the person my parents raised me to be, Eddie would have made it home that night. His mother would still have a son. His sister's children would still have their uncle. Now, I give money to anyone who asks, sometimes more than I can afford. It's not healthy, I know. My therapist says I'm trying to atone for something that wasn't entirely my fault, that I couldn't have known what would happen. But knowledge and feeling are different things, and the feeling is that I failed when it mattered most. Sometimes I dream about that day, but in the dream I give him the $20. He smiles, says thank you sister, and walks away safe. I wake up from those dreams crying, wishing I could go back, wishing I could make the right choice. But time only moves forward, and Eddie is still dead, and I still have to live with the person who was too selfish to save him. I'm sharing this story because I need others to understand. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can save a life, and sometimes the smallest acts of selfishness can end one. That $20 I kept bought me a movie ticket, a large popcorn, and a lifetime of regret. Every time I see someone in need now, I see Eddie's face. Every time someone asks for help, I hear that gunshot. Some people say I shouldn't blame myself, that it was the shooter's fault alone. Maybe they're right legally, morally, technically. But I know what I know. I had the power to save someone's life for $20 and I chose not to. That's a weight I'll carry forever, a reminder of the person I was and the person I'm trying to become. If you're reading this, remember, when someone asks for help, really look at them. See their desperation, their fear, their humanity. Don't assume it's a scam or an inconvenience. Sometimes people are exactly as desperate as they appear. Sometimes $20 is the difference between life and death. Sometimes the smallest kindness can change everything. I hope Eddie forgives me wherever he is. I hope his family found peace. And I hope that by sharing this story, someone else might make a better choice than I did. Because living with this guilt is its own kind of death, a slow poison that reminds me every day that when I had the chance to be good, I chose to be selfish and someone died because of it. The night shift nurse. My name is Sarah, and I've been a registered nurse for 12 years. This happened during my first year when I was 23 and working the night shift at a small hospital in rural Pennsylvania. I need to tell this story because keeping it inside feels like carrying poison in my chest. The hospital was old, built in the 1940s, with long corridors that seemed to stretch forever under flickering fluorescent lights. It had that particular smell all old hospitals have, a mixture of disinfectant, floor wax, and something else, something organic and unsettling that no amount of cleaning could remove. The night shift ran from 11 at night to 7 in the morning, and I was usually assigned to the third floor, which housed long-term patients and those in palliative care. That particular night in October, we were short-staffed. A stomach bug had swept through the nursing staff, leaving just me and Patricia, a veteran nurse in her 50s, to cover the entire floor. Patricia was one of those nurses who'd seen everything and remained unshakable. She had steel gray hair always pulled back in a tight bun and hands that could insert N4 in complete darkness. I admired her and was grateful to be working with someone so experienced. Around 2 in the morning, Patricia went on her break, leaving me alone on the floor. There were 12 patients that night, most sleeping soundly. The ward was quiet except for the usual sounds: the hum of machines, the occasional cough, the squeak of my shoes on the polished floor. I was doing my rounds, checking vitals and medication schedules, when I noticed something odd. Room 314 was supposed to be empty. Mrs. Chin had been discharged that morning, and no new patient was scheduled until the following week. But as I passed by, I saw the door was slightly open, and there was a soft light coming from inside. Not the harsh overhead light, but something dimmer, warmer, like candlelight. I pushed the door open, expecting to find maintenance doing late-night work or maybe another nurse using the empty room for a quick rest. But what I saw made me stop in the doorway, my hand frozen on the handle. There was someone in the bed. An elderly man, probably in his 80s, propped up against the pillows. He was wearing a hospital gown that looked decades old, the kind we hadn't used in years, with narrow blue stripes instead of the current pattern. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and I could see the blue veins underneath like a roadmap of his circulatory system. But it was his eyes that held me. They were completely white, no iris, no pupil, just white orbs that somehow seemed to be looking directly at me. "Please," he said, and his voice was like wind through dry leaves. "Please, I'm so thirsty." Every part of my training told me to help. A patient was asking for water. It was one of the most basic things we do. But every instinct in my body was screaming that something was terribly wrong. This man wasn't on our patient list. I checked the rooms myself at the start of my shift. Room 314 had been empty, the bed stripped and sanitized. I took a step backward, my hand reaching for my phone to call Patricia. But the man sat up straighter, and when he did, I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice. The bed beneath him was dry and clean, but there was water everywhere else. It was seeping out from under the bed, spreading across the floor in a slowly expanding puddle. Not normal water either. It was dark, almost black in the dim light, and it smelled like a pond that had been stagnant for years. "Please," he said again, louder this time. "I've been thirsty for so long. Just one glass of water. Just one." I ran. I'm not proud of it, but I turned and ran down the hallway to the nurse's station, my shoes slipping on the polished floor. I called Patricia, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. She answered on the third ring, sounding annoyed at being disturbed during her break. When I told her about the man in 314, she went silent for a long moment. Then she said something that made everything worse. She told me to stay at the nurse's station and not to go back to that room under any circumstances. She'd be right up. Patricia arrived within minutes, moving faster than I'd ever seen her move. She went straight to room 314 while I watched from the safety of the nurse's station. She stood in the doorway for a long time just looking inside. Then she closed the door firmly, produced a key I didn't know she had, and locked it. When she came back, her face was pale. She sat down heavily in the chair next to me and was quiet for several minutes. Finally, she told me a story that explained everything and nothing at the same time. In 1978, 45 years ago, there had been a patient in room 314 named Harold Morrison. He'd been admitted with severe dehydration after being found in his apartment, where he'd fallen and been unable to get up for 3 days. The day shift nurse had forgotten to check on him, assuming the night shift had handled his 4. The night shift nurse made the same assumption about the day shift. For 18 hours, Harold received no fluids despite repeatedly calling for water. By the time the error was discovered, it was too late. Harold died of acute renal failure brought on by severe dehydration. He died thirsty, begging for water that never came. The 2 nurses responsible were fired, and the hospital implemented new procedures to prevent such negligence. But that wasn't the end of Harold's story. Patricia said that every few years, always in October, always during the night shift, Harold comes back to room 314. He appears in the bed, asking for water. Some nurses, not knowing the history, have tried to help him. Patricia knew of 3 who'd brought him water over the years. Each one had suffered the same fate. Within a month, they died of kidney failure, their bodies mysteriously unable to process fluids despite having no prior kidney issues. The water that appears with him, Patricia explained, isn't water at all. It's something else, something that spreads out looking for someone to blame, someone to punish for Harold's death. The hospital administration knew about it but kept it quiet. They simply kept room 314 off the booking system during October and made sure experienced nurses like Patricia knew to keep it locked. I worked at that hospital for 3 more years, always taking care to avoid room 314 in October. But even in other months I could feel something wrong with that room. The temperature was always a few degrees colder, and sometimes even with the door locked, you could hear something that sounded like an old man's voice, weak and pleading, asking for water. I transferred to a different hospital eventually, partly for career advancement but mostly to get away from room 314. But sometimes on quiet nights during my shift I think about Harold Morrison. I think about dying thirsty in a place where help was just feet away but never came. And I understand his anger, his need for someone to pay for that negligence. What haunts me most isn't the supernatural element. It's the original sin that created it. 2 nurses who didn't do their job, who assumed someone else would handle it, who let a man die of thirst in a building full of caregivers. Harold's ghost, if that's what it was, is just the echo of that failure, repeating endlessly, seeking the water that never came and the justice that was never served. I still work night shifts, but I'm meticulous about checking on every patient, especially those who can't advocate for themselves. Because I've seen what happens when we fail in our duty of care. Sometimes the consequences last far longer than a lifetime. Sometimes they wait in empty rooms asking for water, reminding us that our negligence can become someone else's eternity. The substitute teacher. My name is Marcus and I taught high school history for 15 years before I quit. Not retired, not transferred, quit. Walked out in the middle of the semester and never went back. This is why. It was 2018 and I was teaching at Jefferson High School in a small town in Ohio. The school was one of those sprawling brick buildings from the 1960s, with narrow windows that barely let in light and radiators that clanged like ghost chains all winter. I'd been there 8 years and knew every creaky floorboard, every stubborn locker, every hiding spot where kids went to skip class. That September we had a new substitute teacher join the roster. Her name was Miss Elmwood, though she insisted everyone call her Miss E. She was young, maybe 25, with long red hair she wore in a tight braid and clothes that seemed outdated even for our conservative town. Long skirts, high-neck blouses, the kind of things you'd see in photographs from the 1950s. What struck everyone about Missy was her availability. Most substitutes had other jobs or commitments, but she was always free no matter when we called. Sick at 6 in the morning? Missy could be there by 7. Emergency in the middle of the day? She'd arrive within minutes, always carrying the same worn leather satchel, always wearing that same pleasant but distant smile. The students had mixed reactions to her. Some found her creepy, saying she never blinked enough and that her smile never reached her eyes. Others seemed mesmerized by her, hanging on every word during her lessons. She had a way of teaching that was different from the rest of us. She didn't use textbooks or prepared materials. Instead, she told stories, vivid, detailed stories about historical events as if she'd been there herself. I first became suspicious when she substituted for my colleague Jennifer, who taught American history. Jennifer had left detailed lesson plans about the Civil War, but when I passed by the classroom, Missy was telling the students about a completely different topic, the Salem witch trials. Her voice carried into the hallway and something about it made me stop and listen. She was describing a particular execution in detail that I'd never heard before, despite having studied that period extensively. She talked about the smell of the wood smoke, the texture of the rope, the sound a neck makes when it breaks. The students were dead silent, transfixed. When I looked through the door's window, I saw them all leaning forward, their eyes glazed over like they were in a trance. After class, I asked a few students what they thought. Most couldn't really remember specifics, just that Missy's class had been intense and different. But one student, Tommy Rodriguez, looked genuinely shaken. He pulled me aside and told me that during the lesson, he could have sworn he smelled smoke and felt heat on his face, like standing near a bonfire. I started paying more attention to Missy after that. I noticed things that didn't add up. She never ate lunch in the teacher's lounge, never used the bathroom, never seemed to arrive or leave. She'd just appear when needed and vanish when her substitution was over. Her employment paperwork was all in order, according to the administration, but when I asked to see it, I was told it was confidential. The turning point came in November. I had to take a sick day for a dental procedure, and Missy covered my classes. I'd left clear instructions to show a documentary about World War I and have the students take notes. Simple, straightforward, impossible to deviate from. Or so I thought. When I returned the next day, my students were different. They sat straighter, moved in unison, and when I asked about the documentary, they all gave the exact same response, word for word. Missy taught us about the importance of sacrifice. I pressed them for details. What sacrifice? What did she mean? But they just stared at me with those glazed eyes and repeated the same phrase. Even my most rebellious students, the ones who usually couldn't sit still for 5 minutes, were perfectly still and obedient. That afternoon, I found Tommy Rodriguez crying in the bathroom. When I asked what was wrong, he told me Missy had shown them something during my absence. Not a documentary, but something else. He couldn't describe it clearly, his words coming out jumbled and confused, but he kept saying, "She made us watch. She made us all watch them burn." I went to the principal immediately, But Dr. Harrison just gave me a condescending smile and said Missy was one of our most requested substitutes. Parents loved her, students' test scores improved after her lessons, and there had been no formal complaints. He suggested I was perhaps feeling threatened by a younger, more dynamic teacher. But I knew something was deeply wrong. I started researching Miss E, trying to find information about her background, her credentials, anything. What I found made my blood run cold. There had been a teacher named Elizabeth Elmwood, matching Miss E's description exactly, down to the red hair and outdated clothing. She taught at Jefferson High School in 1952 and had died in a fire that consumed the old school building, along with 12 students who'd been trapped in her classroom. The fire had been ruled suspicious but never solved. The surviving students had told strange stories about Miss Elmwood holding special after-school sessions where she taught them about old ways and forgotten knowledge. Some parents had complained she was teaching witchcraft, but this was dismissed as hysteria, until the fire. I dug deeper and found newspaper articles from various years: 1967, 1981, 1995, 2009. Every 15 years or so, there were reports of a substitute teacher matching Miss Elmwood's description, always at schools that would later experience tragedies. Fires, mostly, but also mass illnesses, unexplained accidents, students disappearing. The pattern was always the same. She'd substitute for a few months, certain students would become her favorites, behaving strangely and speaking about sacrifice in old ways. Then something terrible would happen and she'd vanish, only to reappear years later at a different school. I tried to warn people, but no one would listen. Dr. Harrison threatened to suspend me for spreading rumors. Other teachers avoided me, thinking I was having a breakdown. Even my wife suggested I take a leave of absence, get some help. The end came in December, 3 days before winter break. I arrived at school early, around 6:30 a.m. to finish grading papers. The building was mostly empty, just me and the custodial staff. As I walked past the history wing, I heard voices coming from my classroom. Multiple voices, chanting something in a language I didn't recognize. I looked through the door's window and saw them. 12 students sitting in a circle on the floor, holding hands. Missy stood in the center, her hair loose and wild, her arms raised above her head. The air around her seemed to shimmer like heat waves, and I could smell smoke even through the closed door. She was speaking, but her voice was different, older, multi-layered, like several people talking at once. The students swayed in unison, their eyes rolled back, showing only white. I recognized them all. They were the quiet ones, the ones who'd been most affected by her substitutions. I burst through the door, shouting for them to stop. The moment I crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped so fast my breath came out in clouds. Missy turned to look at me, and her face wasn't human anymore. It kept shifting, showing different faces, all of them young, all of them terrified. The 12 students who died in the fire, I realized. She was wearing their faces like masks. "You shouldn't be here, Mr. Marcus," she said, and her voice was like crackling flames. "The sacrifice isn't ready. They haven't learned enough yet." I grabbed the nearest student, pulling them out of the circle. The moment the circle broke, the spell or whatever it was shattered. The students collapsed, unconscious but breathing. Missy let out a sound that wasn't quite a scream, more like the roar of a backdraft. She moved toward me and I felt heat building, my skin starting to blister. That's when the fire alarm went off. The sprinkler system activated, dousing everything in cold water. Missy recoiled, her form flickering like a dying flame. She gave me one last look, and in that moment I saw her true face. Not the young teacher, but something ancient and hungry, something that fed on youth and innocence. She vanished, simply dissolved into smoke and shadow. The students woke up with no memory of what had happened. They were treated for smoke inhalation, though no one could find the source of any fire. The official report blamed a malfunction in the heating system. I quit that day, walked out and never came back. I couldn't stay in a place where something like Missy could walk the halls, where the administration would rather maintain their test scores than protect their students. I moved 3 states away and took a job in corporate training, far from any classroom. But I still checked the news from Jefferson High and other schools in the area. I watched for reports of new substitute teachers, especially ones with red hair and outdated clothes. Because I know Missy is still out there, still teaching, still preparing her sacrifices. And someday, when she has enough students who've learned her lessons, when she's gathered enough young souls who speak of sacrifice, the fire will come again. If you're a parent, Pay attention to your children's substitute teachers. If they come home speaking about sacrifice, about old ways, about a Missy who tells stories that seem too real, don't wait. Don't rationalize. Get them out. Because some teachers don't want to educate your children. They want to collect them. The Wedding Photographer. My name is David, and for 10 years, I was one of the most sought-after wedding photographers in New England. I've shot over 300 weddings, from backyard ceremonies to elaborate affairs in Newport mansions. But I'll never photograph another wedding. I can't. Not after what happened at the Blackwood estate. It was supposed to be the job of a lifetime. October 2019, a wealthy couple getting married at the abandoned Blackwood mansion in the Berkshires. They'd gotten special permission to use the grounds for a Gothic vintage-themed wedding. The bride, Jessica, was an heiress to some tech fortune. The groom, Christopher, came from old money. They were paying me 5 times my usual rate for exclusive rights to all the photos. The Blackwood mansion had been empty since 1978 when the entire Blackwood family, 7 people across 3 generations, had died in what was ruled a murder-suicide. The patriarch, Edmund Blackwood, had allegedly poisoned the family dinner before hanging himself in the ballroom. The estate had been tied up in legal battles ever since, slowly decaying while lawyers argued over ownership. Jessica thought the history added to the romance. She wanted to reclaim the space for love, as she put it. I thought it was morbid, but for that kind of money I kept my opinions to myself. I arrived at the estate 3 hours before the ceremony to scout locations and set up equipment. The mansion was exactly what you'd expect. A massive Victorian structure with towers, gables, and more rooms than anyone could need. The outside had been cleaned up for the wedding, but inside, most of the house remained untouched. Dust covers over furniture, cobwebs in corners, that musty smell of a place that hadn't seen fresh air in decades. The ceremony was to be held in the garden, with the reception in the ballroom where Edmund Blackwood had died. The wedding planner, a nervous woman named Patricia, had done her best to make the ballroom presentable. They'd brought in chandeliers, draped fabric over the worst of the decay, and set up tables and chairs for the 100 guests. But you could still see the beam where Edmund had hanged himself, a massive oak timber that ran across the ceiling. As I was setting up my equipment in the ballroom, testing the lighting, I took a few practice shots. When I reviewed them on my camera's LCD screen, I noticed something odd. In one corner of every photo, there was a dark shape like a person standing in the shadows. But when I looked at that corner with my naked eye, it was empty. I cleaned my lens, thinking it was a smudge, and took more shots. The shape was still there, and now it seemed closer, more defined. Through the camera, I could make out what looked like a man in an old-fashioned suit, standing perfectly still, watching me. I lowered the camera and walked to that corner. Nothing. Empty space. But when I raised the camera again, he was there, clearer now. An elderly man with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed to bore through the lens. Edmund Blackwood. I recognized him from the portraits hanging in the hallway. My hands were shaking, but I kept taking photos, documenting what I was seeing. In each shot, he moved closer, though I never saw him move. It was like those weeping angel statues, advancing only when you weren't looking directly at them. By the 10th photo, he was standing right in front of my camera, his face filling the frame, his mouth open in what might have been a scream or a laugh. I should have left then. Should have made up an excuse, returned the deposit, and driven away. But I convinced myself it was a trick of the light, maybe something to do with the old mirrors on the walls creating reflections. Besides, the guests were starting to arrive, and Jessica was counting on me. The ceremony went smoothly. Golden hour light, the bride looking radiant, the groom handsome and attentive. I took hundreds of photos, and in the viewfinder, everything looked perfect. It wasn't until the reception that things went truly wrong. The ballroom looked beautiful in the candlelight. The guests were laughing, drinking, dancing to the string quartet. I was moving through the crowd, capturing candid moments when I noticed something through my camera. The guests weren't alone. In every photo there were extra people. Translucent figures in outdated clothing standing among the wedding guests. A woman in a 1970s dress standing behind the bride's mother. A teenage boy in bell-bottoms leaning against the bar. A little girl in a nightgown sitting under the gift table. 7 additional people in every shot. The Blackwood family. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that they were interacting with the living guests. Through my camera, I could see them touching people, whispering in their ears, dancing with partners who didn't know they were there. And wherever they touched someone, that person's expression would change. Their smile would become forced, their eyes would go vacant, and they'd start moving in strange jerky ways like marionettes. I watched in horror as the grandmother of the bride began dancing with Edmund Blackwood's ghost. In reality, she was dancing alone, spinning slowly in the corner, her arms held up to embrace nothing. But through my camera, I could see him leading her, his ghostly hands on her waist, his mouth moving as if speaking to her. Her face through the lens was rapturous, tears streaming down her cheeks. I tried to warn people, pulling the wedding planner aside and showing her the photos on my camera. But on the LCD screen, the ghosts didn't appear. The photos looked normal, just regular wedding shots. It was only through the viewfinder, in the moment of capture, that I could see them. As the night progressed, more guests fell under the influence of the dead family. The string quartet began playing music that wasn't on their set list, a discordant waltz that sounded like it was being played backward. The groom's father started speaking in a voice that wasn't his own, reciting what sounded like a sermon about the sanctity of family bonds that transcend death. Then Jessica, the bride, stood up to make a toast. But when she opened her mouth, the voice that came out was that of a young woman, but not her voice. Through my camera, I could see another woman, a young bride from the 1970s, standing inside Jessica, occupying the same space, moving her like a puppet. "We're so happy you could join us," the voice said through Jessica's mouth. "The Blackwood family has been alone for so long. But tonight we celebrate together. Tonight we become one family, united forever." The guests began to applaud, but it was mechanical, synchronized. Through my viewfinder, I could see the dead Blackwoods standing behind each guest, their ghostly hands on the living's shoulders, controlling them. Only a few people, myself included, seemed unaffected, probably because we were staff, not guests, not part of the family being united. I ran to the bathroom and locked myself in, trying to think. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. There was someone standing behind me. Not visible to my eye, but in the mirror's reflection, clear as day. A young man in a suit from the 1970s, Edmund's son based on the family portraits. He was reaching for me, his hand almost touching my shoulder. I spun around, swinging my camera like a weapon. It passed through empty air, but I heard something, a whisper or a sigh, and the presence retreated. That's when I realized the camera wasn't just showing me the ghosts. It was protecting me from them. As long as I was looking through it, documenting them, they couldn't touch me directly. I went back to the ballroom, camera raised, and what I saw was a nightmare. The wedding had become a macabre dance of the living and the dead. The Blackwood family was attempting to possess the guests, to use them to live again. Some guests were already fully taken over, their own souls pushed aside. Others were fighting, their faces twisted in silent screams that only I could see through my lens. Christopher, the groom, was the worst. Edmund Blackwood wasn't just possessing him, he was replacing him. Through the camera, I could see Christopher's spirit being pushed out of his own body, becoming transparent while Edmund solidified inside him. I did the only thing I could think of. I started taking photos rapidly, the flash firing again and again like a strobe light. Each flash seemed to disrupt the ghosts, making them flicker and weaken their hold. Some guests snapped out of their trances, looking confused and frightened. Others ran for the exits. Edmund's ghost turned to me, and through the viewfinder, I saw him clearly for the first time. His face was twisted with rage, but also hunger, a desperate need to live again. He started moving toward me, and the other dead Blackwoods followed. 7 ghosts converging on me, the only person documenting their crime. I kept shooting, the camera's flash creating a barrier of light between us. But I was running out of battery and they knew it. They pressed closer and I could feel the temperature dropping, my breath coming out in clouds. The camera died just as Edmund reached for me. In that moment, something unexpected happened. Jessica, the real Jessica, not the possessed version, grabbed my arm. The contact broke whatever spell was trying to take hold. She'd managed to fight off the ghost trying to possess her, and together we ran from the ballroom, leaving behind the chaos of the living and the dead. We made it outside where other fleeing guests had gathered. Someone had called the police, but when they arrived, they found only a confused crowd and an empty ballroom. No sign of the chaos I'd witnessed. The remaining guests who'd been possessed had no memory of what happened. The official story was that someone had spiked the punch, causing mass hallucinations. But I had the proof, or so I thought. When I got home and uploaded the photos from my camera, they were all corrupted. Every single file was damaged beyond recovery. Except for one. The very last photo I'd taken before the battery died. It showed the ballroom in chaos, guests dancing with invisible partners, their faces twisted in unnatural expressions. And in the center, barely visible but definitely there, the translucent figures of 7 people in 1970s clothing, the Blackwood family finally attending one last party in their home. Jessica and Christopher's marriage was annulled within a month. Christopher claimed no memory of the wedding at all, said he'd lost an entire day. Jessica never spoke publicly about what happened, but she sent me a message thanking me for saving her. She also warned me never to use a camera at the Blackwood estate again. She'd learned from her research that Edmund Blackwood had been an amateur photographer, obsessed with capturing the perfect family portrait. Perhaps that's why the ghosts were visible through cameras, and why they'd waited for someone like me to document their return. I still have that one photo locked in a safe deposit box. Sometimes I think about destroying it, but I can't bring myself to do it. It's evidence that some venues should stay abandoned, some families should stay extinct, and some weddings should never be photographed. I work in real estate photography now. No more weddings, no more celebrations of union and family. Because I've seen what happens when the dead decide they want to join the party. And I know that somewhere, in some abandoned mansion or forgotten estate, they're waiting for the next photographer to capture their moment, to document their return to the world of the living. If you ever attend a wedding at an allegedly haunted venue, watch the photographer. If they seem frightened, if they keep checking their camera with growing alarm, if they suddenly pack up and leave, you should follow them. Because they might be seeing something you can't, something that's about to make you part of a very different kind of family portrait, one that lasts forever. The Hotel Night Manager. My name is Robert, and I managed the night shift at the Grandview Hotel in Colorado for 7 years. I'm telling this story because people need to know why I left, and why that hotel should never, ever rent out room 2117. The Grandview was one of those massive resort hotels built in the 1920s, nestled in the Rocky Mountains. 500 rooms, multiple restaurants, a ballroom that could hold 1,000 people. During ski season, we'd be completely booked. During the off-season, the place felt like a magnificent tomb, with entire floors sitting empty and dark. I started there in 2015, taking the night manager position because it paid well, and I've always been a night owl. The shift ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and mostly consisted of handling late arrivals, dealing with noise complaints, and managing the skeleton crew of night staff. It was peaceful work, usually. The hotel had its quirks like any old building, but nothing I couldn't handle. The problem started in my 3rd year, late September 2018. We were in that dead period between summer tourists and ski season, maybe 40% occupancy. I was doing my rounds on the 21st floor when I noticed something odd. Room 2117's door was open, just a crack, and I could hear music coming from inside. Old music, the scratchy kind you'd hear on a gramophone. I checked my system. Room 2117 was supposed to be vacant. In fact, according to our records, it had been vacant for 3 months. We'd had some issue with the heating system, and maintenance had been putting off the repairs. I approached the door, preparing to find some confused guest who'd been given the wrong key card. I knocked, called out, "Hotel management." No response, but the music continued. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was freezing, my breath visible in the air, and it was set up all wrong. Instead of our modern furniture, it contained antique pieces. A 4-poster bed with heavy curtains, a wooden vanity with an ornate mirror, a gramophone on a side table playing that eerie music. But what made me stumble backward was the woman. She was sitting at the vanity, brushing her long blonde hair with slow, methodical strokes. She wore a silk nightgown from another era, cream-colored with lace trim. Through the mirror, I could see her face, beautiful but wrong somehow, like a photograph that's been colorized poorly. Her lips were too red, her skin too pale, her eyes too bright. "You're early," she said without turning around. Her voice had an accent I couldn't place, something vaguely European. "The party doesn't start until midnight." I tried to speak, to ask who she was, how she'd gotten in, but my throat felt frozen. She continued brushing her hair, humming along with the music. Then she stood and turned to face me, and I saw that the back of her head was wrong. It was caved in, matted with what looked like dried blood and fragments of bone. She smiled at my expression. "Don't look so shocked, darling. We all have our flaws." I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I sprinted to the elevator, jabbed the button repeatedly, and didn't stop shaking until I was back in my office behind a locked door. I checked the security footage for the 21st floor. The hallway camera showed me approaching room 2117, standing in the doorway for about 30 seconds, then running away. But the door never opened. On the footage, it remained closed the entire time. I pulled up the hotel's history files, something we kept for insurance and legal purposes. What I found made my blood run cold. In September 1928, exactly 90 years earlier, a woman named Eliza Ashford had been murdered in room 2117. She'd been a socialite, married to a wealthy businessman, and had been having an affair with a traveling musician. Her husband had found them together and killed them both with a hammer before jumping from the window. The file included a photograph from the crime scene. I recognized the furniture immediately, the same antique pieces I'd seen in the room. And there was Eliza, lying on the floor beside the vanity, the back of her head destroyed. I should have quit then, but I needed the job, and I convinced myself it had been a hallucination brought on by too much caffeine and not enough sleep. I avoided the 21st floor for the rest of the week and tried to forget what I'd seen. But then October arrived and things got worse. It started with complaints from guests on the 21st floor. They reported hearing music at all hours, the sound of parties that seemed to be coming from inside the walls. Some said they saw people in the hallways dressed in 1920s clothing who vanished when approached. One family checked out in the middle of the night, claiming someone had been trying to open their door from the inside, not the hallway but actually inside their room, trying to get out. I had to investigate. It was my job. Every night I'd go to the 21st floor, and every night it got stranger. The temperature would drop suddenly. Lights would flicker in patterns that seemed almost like Morse code. And room 2117's door was always open now, just a crack with that music playing. On October 15th I saw them all. I'd gone up to investigate another noise complaint and found the entire hallway transformed. The modern carpet was gone, replaced by rich Persian runners. The LED lights had become gas lamps. And the hallway was full of people, dozens of them, all dressed in 1920s attire. They were laughing, drinking from champagne glasses, dancing to music that seemed to come from everywhere at once. They noticed me immediately. A man in a pinstriped suit approached, his face jovial until he got close enough for me to see that his throat had been cut, the wound gaping like a second smile. "You're not dressed for the party," he said, his voice gurgling through the wound. "Eliza won't like that." I backed away, but they were all around me now. A woman in a beaded dress with a bullet hole in her forehead. A young man whose face was half melted, as if from acid. Children, God help me, there were children there too, their party clothes soaked in blood. All of them had died in the hotel over the decades, I realized. All of them were here for Eliza's eternal party. "She's been waiting for you," the man with the cut throat said. "She needs a new dance partner. The last one wore out in 1997. I looked toward room 2117. The door was wide open now and I could see inside. The room was massive, impossibly large, stretching back farther than the building could contain. It was full of more party guests, hundreds of them, all dancing and swaying to that scratchy music. And in the center, Eliza stood in a wedding dress that had turned gray with age and blood. She looked at me and smiled. "There you are, darling. I've been so lonely." The dead guests began pushing me toward the room. Their hands were cold and solid, real despite their impossibility. I struggled, but there were too many of them. Just as they got me to the threshold, the elevator dinged. The night security guard, Jake, stepped out, took one look at the scene, and immediately started praying in Spanish while backing into the elevator. His presence broke whatever spell was happening. The lights flickered back to normal, the carpet returned, and the dead vanished like smoke. I was standing alone in a modern hotel hallway, gasping for breath, with only the faint sound of music coming from room 2117. I quit that night. Didn't even finish my shift, just walked out and never went back. But before I left, I did one thing. I went to the maintenance room and found the circuit breaker for room 2117. I didn't just turn it off. I removed it entirely, then sealed the room's door with industrial adhesive. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it might buy some time. I heard from Jake a few months later. The hotel had tried to renovate room 2117, turn it into a storage space. The construction crew quit after one day. They said the walls bled when they tried to drill into them, and their tools would disappear only to reappear arranged in threatening messages. The hotel finally just walled it off, telling guests that floor only has 16 rooms now. But Jake also told me something that keeps me up at night. He said that sometimes when he does his rounds he can hear the party spreading. Faint music from room 2115, then 2113, then 2111. Like Eliza's party is growing room by room, searching for a way out. Looking for new guests to join her eternal celebration. If you ever stay at the Grandview Hotel, request a room on any floor but the 21st. And if you hear old music in the hallways, don't investigate. Don't be curious, just leave. Because Eliza Ashford's party has been going on for 90 years, and she's always looking for new guests who'll never be able to check out. The school bus driver. My name is Dorothy, and I drove school buses for 23 years in rural Maine. I'm retired now, but there's one route I need to tell you about. Route 47. The one that made me understand why some roads should never be traveled after dark. I started driving buses in 1998, right after my youngest went off to college. It was good work, steady, and I loved the kids. You get to watch them grow up, see the shy kindergartners become confident high schoolers. Most days were routine. Same stops, same faces, same chatter about homework and crushes and weekend plans. Route 47 was different from the start. It was the longest route in our district, winding through the backwoods to pick up kids from the isolated farms and old houses scattered throughout the county. Some of these kids would be on the bus for over an hour each way. The route included Old Hollow Road, a stretch of about 4 miles that cut through dense pine forest with no houses, no lights, nothing but trees that seemed to press in on both sides. The regular driver for Route 47 had quit suddenly in September 2007. Just walked into the supervisor's office, left the keys on the desk, and walked out without a word. When they called him, he'd only say, "I won't drive that route anymore. Not after what I saw." He never explained further, moved out of state within the month. I volunteered to take over. The pay was better for the longer route, and I figured the previous driver had just burned out. The first few weeks were fine. I picked up 17 kids along the route, ranging from 6 to 18 years old. They were quieter than most groups, but I attributed that to the early morning hour and the long ride. It was in October when I first noticed something wrong. I was driving through Old Hollow Road just as the sun was setting, returning from an after-school activity run. The bus was empty except for me. As I rounded a particularly sharp curve, my headlights swept across something on the side of the road. A school bus, identical to mine, parked among the trees. I slowed down, thinking another driver might need help. But as I got closer, I realized the bus was old, really old. The yellow paint was faded and peeling, rust eating through the metal like cancer. The windows were fogged over, but I could see shapes inside. Small shapes. Child-sized shapes. They weren't moving. I stopped my bus, grabbed my flashlight, and got out. The moment my feet hit the ground, the temperature dropped 20 degrees. My breath came out in clouds, and frost began forming on my windshield. I approached the abandoned bus, flashlight beam shaking in my trembling hand. The door of the old bus was open. Inside I could see them clearly. Children, maybe a dozen of them, sitting in the seats. But they were wrong. Their clothes were from different eras, some from the 50s, others from the 70s, one boy in what looked like turn-of-the-century clothing. They were all staring straight ahead, unblinking, their faces pale as paper. One of them, a girl about 8 years old in a faded pink dress, slowly turned her head to look at me. Her eyes were completely black, no whites at all. She opened her mouth, and instead of words, the sound of an engine trying to start came out. That grinding, mechanical noise of a motor that won't turn over. I ran back to my bus and drove away as fast as safely possible. When I looked in my rearview mirror, the old bus was gone. Just trees where it had been parked. I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? But I started paying more attention to Route 47, researching its history. What I found was a pattern of tragedies. School buses that had crashed or disappeared along that route dating back to when motorized school transport began. 7 incidents over 90 years. Children who never made it home. The worst was in 1952. A bus carrying 12 children had broken down on Old Hollow Road during a blizzard. The driver left to get help, telling the kids to stay put. When rescue arrived the next morning, the bus was empty. They found the children's bodies scattered through the woods, all frozen to death. They tried to walk home but got lost in the storm. After learning this, I noticed things I'd missed before. My regular kids, the 17 on Route 47, they all had assigned seats and they never deviated. But sometimes I'd count 18 kids. Or 19. The extra ones always sat in the back, never spoke, and none of the regular kids seemed to notice them. One morning in November, thick fog rolled in. Visibility was maybe 10 feet. I was creeping along Old Hollow Road when I heard it. Another engine behind me. I looked in my mirror and saw headlights too close, tailgating me. But that was impossible. No other buses ran this route at this time. The lights got closer and I could make out the shape of the vehicle. It was the old bus, the rusty one I'd seen parked. It was following me and it was getting closer despite the fact that I was accelerating. I could hear its engine now, that same grinding, struggling sound like it was running on something other than gasoline. Then I heard the voices. Children singing. Not my kids, they were silent, some still half asleep. This was coming from the bus behind me. An old song, something about going home, but the words were wrong, backwards somehow. The singing got louder as the bus got closer. Just as I thought it would ram us, Old Hollow Road ended. We emerged from the forest into farmland and the singing stopped. The headlights vanished. In my mirror, just empty road. But when I reached the first stop and opened the door, something was different. There were 18 kids on my bus, not 17. The extra child was sitting in seat 13, a boy maybe 10 years old in clothes from the 1950s. He was soaking wet despite the fact that it hadn't rained in days, and when he stood to get off at a stop that wasn't on my route, he left a puddle of muddy water on the seat. None of the other kids reacted. They couldn't see him. But when he walked past me, he whispered, "She's coming for her collection soon. The road needs its payment." December brought the worst storm we'd seen in years. The district considered canceling school but decided against it. I begged my supervisor to at least cancel Route 47, but he laughed it off. "Dorothy, you getting superstitious on us? It's just a little snow." That morning, as I drove through Old Hollow Road in the pre-dawn darkness, my bus began to struggle. The engine coughed, sputtered. The headlights flickered. And then we stopped. Dead in the middle of the road, in the exact spot where that 1952 bus had broken down. The kids woke up, murmuring nervously. I tried to restart the engine. Nothing. I grabbed my radio to call for help, but it was dead too. My cell phone had no signal. We were alone in the dark forest with snow beginning to fall heavily. That's when I heard the other engine. The grinding, struggling sound of the old bus. My kids heard it too now, their murmuring turning to frightened whispers. Through the windshield, I saw headlights approaching from ahead, not behind. The old bus was coming straight at us. It stopped just feet from my bumper. The door opened and she stepped out. Not a child, but a woman in an old-fashioned dress, the kind a schoolmarm would wear in the 1920s. Her face was kind but terrible, aged but timeless. She walked to my door and it opened on its own. "It's time," she said, her voice like wind through dead leaves. "The road has been patient, but it needs its payment. 7 times 7 years have passed. Choose 7 or lose them all." I understood then. Every 49 years, the road demanded 7 children. 7 to join the eternal bus ride, the one that never reaches home. The previous driver had faced this choice and ran rather than make it. I looked back at my 17 kids, their faces pale with terror. How could I choose? How could anyone choose? But I could see the shadows gathering outside, shapes of all the children the road had taken over the decades, pressing against the windows, eager for new friends to join their endless journey. "I'll go," I said. "Take me instead." The woman smiled, sad and knowing. "A driver for the children. An interesting offer. But you're old. You won't last long." "Long enough," I said. "Let these kids go home. I'll drive the others. I'll be their driver until another takes your place," she finished. "Very well. But know this, you'll drive that route forever, in the spaces between seconds, in the moments between night and morning. You'll carry the lost children, and one day, someone else will have to make the same choice you're avoiding now." I agreed. What else could I do? The woman touched my hand and cold shot through me like lightning. My bus started immediately, the radio crackled to life. I drove my 17 kids to school in silence. They didn't remember what had happened, just that we'd been delayed by engine trouble. I quit that afternoon just like the driver before me. But I didn't leave town. I couldn't. Because now, in the early morning hours when the living world sleeps, I drive the other route. The one that exists parallel to Route 47, in the shadows of Old Hollow Road. I pick up the lost children, the ones from 1952 and all the others. They're always trying to get home, always hoping this time the bus will take them there. But it never does. We just drive in circles, through a forest that doesn't quite exist, while they sing their backward songs and leave puddles of time-lost water on the seats. Sometimes I see the living bus pass by, the new driver hurrying through Old Hollow Road. I try to warn them, flash my lights, honk my horn. But they can't see me. Not yet. Not until their 49 years are up, and the road demands its payment again. If you ever drive through rural Maine and see an old school bus in your rearview mirror on an empty road, don't stop. Don't investigate. Just keep driving until you're out of the forest. Because the lost children are always looking for new friends, and their driver, God help me, I'm always looking for my replacement. The pawn shop owner. My name is Vincent, and I owned a pawn shop in Detroit for 18 years. I sold it last year, took a massive loss just to get rid of it. I don't care about the money anymore. I just needed to get away from the things people bring in when they're desperate, and the things that sometimes come looking for what's been sold. I opened VJ's Pawn and Gold in 2004, in a rough part of the city where people needed quick cash and didn't ask too many questions. I'd been in the business since the 90s, working for other shops, learning how to spot real gold from fake, authentic antiques from reproductions, and most importantly, when to say no to a deal that felt wrong. The shop was nothing special. Barred windows, reinforced door, security cameras covering every angle. Inside, the usual mix of electronics, jewelry, tools, and musical instruments. I had a back room for the valuable stuff and a basement for overflow inventory. It was a good business. Honest mostly. I helped people in tight spots and made a decent living doing it. Everything changed when she walked in. October 2019, just before Halloween. She was elderly, maybe 80, dressed in layers of old clothing despite the warm afternoon. She moved slowly, pulling a small wheeled cart behind her, the kind you see homeless folks using. But her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and when she looked at me, I felt like she could see straight through to my soul. "I need to pawn some items," she said. Her voice was cultured, refined, completely at odds with her appearance. "Family heirlooms. I need exactly $737. Specific amount." That was my first red flag. Most people just say they need as much as they can get. She lifted a cloth bag onto my counter and I heard metal clicking inside. She pulled out the first item and my breath caught. It was a pocket watch, gold, but not just any gold. This was old, handcrafted, the kind of piece you see in museums. The inscription on the back was in Latin, and the hands moved in ways that didn't match any standard time. As I held it, I could swear I heard whispering, multiple voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize. "That belonged to my grandfather," she said. "He was a collector of unusual things." The next item was a ring, silver with a black stone that seemed to absorb light. When I looked into it, I saw movement like something swimming in dark water. Then came a brass compass that pointed to a direction that didn't exist, a pair of spectacles that made everything look wrong when I glanced through them, and finally, a small wooden box that was warm to the touch and had no visible way to open it. Every instinct I'd developed over years in this business screamed at me to refuse the deal. But there was something about the woman, a desperation that felt genuine. And despite the unsettling nature of the items, they were clearly valuable. The gold alone in the watch was worth more than she was asking. $737, I said, writing up the ticket. "You have 90 days to reclaim them." She smiled, and for a moment, her face seemed younger. "I won't be coming back. But someone will. When they do, don't let them have all 5 together. Never all 5 together." She took the money and left, moving faster than she had when she entered. I watched her on the security cameras as she exited, but she didn't appear on the footage. The tape showed me completing a transaction with no one, talking to empty air, handling items that materialized from nowhere. I put the 5 items in the safe in the back room, each in a separate section. That night I had the first dream. I was in my shop, but it was different. The walls breathed like living tissue, the floor was soft and warm, and all the pawned items were alive, whispering their histories, begging to be reunited with their owners. In the dream I saw the woman again, but she was young, maybe 25, and she was running from something. She clutched the 5 items to her chest as shadows with too many angles pursued her through city streets that didn't belong to any earthly city. She turned to me and said, "They're coming for their tools. Don't let them have them all." I woke up to find the basement door open. I never left it open. I lived in the apartment above the shop and I could hear movement below. I grabbed my baseball bat and crept downstairs. The shop was empty, but things had been moved. Every item in the store had been turned to face the back room where the safe was. Hundreds of objects, all pointing like compass needles toward those 5 items. Over the next weeks, people started coming and asking about them. Not together, but separately, each describing one of the items perfectly despite my never having displayed them. A man in an expensive suit asked about the pocket watch, said it had been in his family for generations. A young woman with tattoos covering her arms wanted the ring, claimed it was her birthright. Twins, identical down to their mismatched eyes, came for the spectacles. I refused them all. Something was wrong with these people. They didn't blink enough, their shadows fell in the wrong direction, and when they spoke, I could hear other voices underneath their words, like a radio picking up multiple stations. Then came the night of November 15th. I was closing up when all 5 came at once. The man in the suit, the tattooed woman, the twins, and a new one, an elderly priest who wanted the wooden box. They stood in my shop, not threatening exactly, but their presence made the air thick and hard to breathe. "We'll pay 10 times what you gave her," the man in the suit said. His smile had too many teeth. "A simple transaction." The woman said not to sell them together, I replied, my hand on the silent alarm button. The tattooed woman laughed and the sound made my windows crack. "The old witch is dead. Has been for decades. You met her echo, her last spell, designed to keep us from our property." "Your property?" I asked. The priest stepped forward and I could smell sulfur and incense. Tools of our trade, you might say. Separated, they're merely curious. Together, they open doors that have been closed for very good reasons. I looked at them, really looked, and saw what they were hiding. The man in the suit had no reflection in my security mirrors. The woman's tattoos were moving, writhing across her skin like living things. The twins were sharing a single shadow between them. And the priest's collar was burning his neck, leaving blackened flesh that healed and burned again in an endless cycle. "No deal," I said. They didn't argue. They just stood there waiting. Then the lights went out. In the darkness, I heard the safe in the back room opening, the lock turning on its own. The 5 items emerged, floating through the air, glowing with a sick light that hurt to perceive. But they stopped halfway between the safe and the 5 visitors. The old woman's voice echoed through the shop. "A deal is a deal. 90 days have not passed. The contract holds." The visitors screamed in frustration, their human masks slipping to reveal things I can't adequately describe. Too many eyes, not enough skin, geometries that shouldn't exist in 3-dimensional space. They left, but not before the man in the suit turned to me and said, 74 more days. Then we return. I tried to get rid of the items. Tried to burn them, bury them, throw them in the river. They always returned to the safe, always in their separate sections. I tried to call the woman's family, but the phone number on the pawn ticket connected to a payphone that had been removed in 1987. As the days counted down, more things came looking. Not just the 5, but others. Things that knocked on my windows at 3 a.m. with hands that weren't hands. Voices on the phone speaking in languages that predated human speech. Customers whose faces I couldn't quite remember the moment they left. On the 89th day, one day before the deadline, an old man came in. Normal looking, wearing a janitor's uniform, pushing a mop bucket. He smiled at me with genuine warmth and said, "Martha sent me. Said you might need some help with a particular transaction." Martha. That had been the name the old woman signed on the ticket. The janitor continued, "I'm here to clean up. It's what I do. But I'll need those 5 items to do it properly." I should have been suspicious, but something about him felt right. "Say." I gave him the items, and he placed them carefully in his mop bucket, each wrapped in what looked like ordinary cleaning rags but felt like they were made of something far older than fabric. "They'll come tomorrow," he said. "All of them. When they do, tell them the items were reclaimed. Show them the ticket marked paid in full. They can't argue with the contract." He left and I never saw him again. But he'd done something to the ticket. The signature now showed it had been reclaimed that morning, paid in full, even though I'd never processed the transaction. The next night they came. Not just the 5, but dozens of things that had no business existing in our reality. They filled my shop, demanding their tools, threatening to tear apart the very atoms of the building to find them. I showed them the ticket. Paid in full. Reclaimed by the original owner. They raged. The walls bled, the floor opened into vistas of impossible worlds, and every piece of glass in the shop shattered. But they couldn't argue with the contract. The old woman Martha had bound them with their own rules. They left, taking their fury with them, and my shop returned to normal. Except it never really did. After that night, desperate people brought in stranger and stranger items. A music box that played the sounds of dying stars. A mirror that showed the reflection of whoever looked into it, but 24 hours in the future. A doll that aged while its owner stayed young. I realized my shop had become a way station for cursed things, a place where people could temporarily escape their supernatural debts. And I was trapped there, the keeper of these terrible transactions, unable to close, unable to leave because someone had to hold the contracts. Someone had to maintain the rules that kept even worse things at bay. I lasted 2 more years before I found my replacement, a young woman, ambitious, skeptical of anything supernatural. I sold her the shop for $1, told her it was a tax thing. She laughed, signed the papers, took the keys. I warned her about the safe, told her to never put more than 4 unusual items in it at once. She laughed at that too. I monitored the news from Detroit. The shop is still open. There have been 3 owners since I left, each lasting less time than the one before. The cycle continues, the contracts must be honored, and somewhere out there Martha's Echo is still keeping the 5 tools apart, still preventing doors from opening that should remain closed. If you ever need quick cash in Detroit, avoid VJ's Pawn and Gold. Or if you must go, only pawn ordinary things. Never family heirlooms, never items with history you don't fully understand, and absolutely never anything that whispers when you're alone with it. Because once you enter into a contract with that shop, you become part of its inventory, and some debts can only be paid with more than money.